The Trump economy is sputtering. We learned this morning that job growth in the past 3 months has all but ended. There were just 22,000 new jobs created last month, and new revised data showed the economy actually lost jobs in June, the first time that's happened since President Trump's first term, back when most of us were still in isolation during COVID. And unemployment ticked up to 4.3%, the highest in nearly 4 years. An economy that's stalling out is bad news for any president, but particularly for one who got back into the White House in large part because of what voters saw as his economic acumen. When President Trump didn't like last month's jobs report, he fired the head of the agency that compiles it. This morning, he placed the blame on his economic nemesis, the Fed chair, Jerome Powell. Jerome, too late. Powell should have lowered rates long ago. As usual, he's too late. I'm joined by a terrific group of reporters here. Anne Marie Horton of Bloomberg, CNN's Matt Egan, Abby Livingston of Puck, and Ested Herndon of the New York Times. Matt, take us through some of the numbers and what they mean.
Yeah, Dana, look, this was another brutal jobs report, and this really suggests that after years of historic resilience, the job market is facing some serious trouble right now. I mean, hiring has basically stalled out to almost nothing, right? Just 22,000 jobs added during the month of August. That is a fraction of what economists were expecting. It's crazy to think that not even a year ago, back in December, the economy was adding 300,000+ jobs. Now we're, not even 10% of that. And as you noted, we saw that June was revised lower to show that for the first time since COVID, the U.S. economy actually lost jobs. So that ends this nearly 5-year streak of uninterrupted job growth. That was the second longest streak in American history. It's now over. And then the unemployment rate, so you mentioned that, ticking up from 4.2% to 4.3%. That's not high per se, but it is the highest since late 2021. And Fed Chair Powell, he has said that that's the #1 indicator that he's looking at for evidence of weakness in this job market. I think that we shouldn't rule out the possibility that this is just a slow patch and the economy can rebound from here, right? I mean, job market's been so resilient for so long, but clearly this is another major challenge, and I think the warning signs in the economy are really piling up.
Yeah, and stand by, because I do want to get back to what you just mentioned on the Fed and interest rates. Instead, let's talk politics. Yeah. And I mean, yes, the president likes to say that immigration was a big issue. I'm sure it was. The culture wars, definitely. But we know the biggest reason, and it was the fact that people were hearing from President Biden that the numbers are good, let's just wait, but people didn't feel that way. Now it's the numbers that aren't looking good either.
Exactly. It's a mirror image from kind of 2021 when we had Democrats at that time kind of telling people, don't look at the numbers, don't kind of believe what's in front of you. You kind of hear that from Trump now. This is what we had kind of warned about all through the summer, the prospect that his kind of self-imposed economic crisis, tariffs driving that, could pose not just uncertainty, but a downward job market and really reverse what has been Trump's #1 strength coming into this. But I also think you got to add in the big, beautiful bill with this, right? And it speaks to, I think, is a kind of hypocrisy at the heart of Trump's second term. For all the talk about his growth among working class voters, his growth among working class voters of color, what we have seen in terms of economic reality here is a bill that largely amounts to a wealth transfer, a removal of benefits from SNAP and Medicaid. And I think that's the reason why you see some of those poll numbers, particularly on the economy, reversing among the very groups that delivered Trump the White House last year.
Abby?
You know, Trump immediately pivoted to the Fed and Jerome Powell, but when I talk to Republican sources, they're all worried about tariffs, and the full brunt of that has not been felt yet. Some say we may not feel that. But politically speaking, the question I have is, does this impact the gubernatorial elections in November in New Jersey and Virginia? But moreover, when does this hit next year, if it does, and how does that affect the midterms?
And, you know, there was such hullabaloo, to use a word that probably shouldn't be used very much, Anne-Marie, over the fact that the last month, when the jobs report came out and the president wasn't happy about it, he got rid of the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics that compiles them. And so the Commerce Secretary was on this morning, interestingly, before we all knew what the jobs numbers were, and was once again going after BLS, even though the guy that they removed is no longer there.
they're just bent against the president's success. They're rooting against America and against Donald Trump, and that's got to end. So he can't replace somebody, 2 weeks ago, and you expect fundamental change. But what you will get is an agency that's on side.
Well, there isn't fundamental change yet at BLS. The commissioner actually doesn't even have control over the data. The data is collected by statisticians. They sit in different units. They're almost walled off. And then once the press release is written, it's sent to the commissioner, and the commissioner then sends it off to the White House and the CEA. The one issue that Wall Street has in terms of credibility, and this is the gold standard, the jobs report, the U.S. jobs report is the gold standards of economic data. The one issue that Wall Street has is the fact that when you go out and these statisticians are looking for these surveys, the response rate has been so low for months. That is why we saw massive revisions last year. That is why we are seeing massive revisions now to this point where June actually have a negative print, negative 13,000. That is a huge deal for this economy and for this Federal Reserve. So the problem is that they're not getting 100% of the data when that first print comes out, and this is why you have those revisions. When you talk about, though, the new BLS commissioner, I think only this week his nomination was sent to the Hill. He hasn't even had a hearing yet, and many are still questioning, actually, if he's going to be able to get through Senate confirmation.
Right, exactly. And then there's all of that, but then there's the underlying argument that you're still hearing from the administration, which is to blame the people who are compiling the numbers as opposed to the actual policies. Or maybe it's just the pendulum of the economy.
Yeah, the argument there, it's an interesting one. It would kind of be like if you had an NFL owner, right, whose team just lost big, and instead of changing the quarterback or the play calling or firing the head coach, they go out and fire the scoreboard operator, right? I mean, you might not like the score, but there's probably some bigger issues out there, and shooting the messenger is probably not going to fix anything. But to get back to something we were discussing earlier about the self-imposed nature of some of this, let's look at manufacturing, right? So tariffs, they're supposed to be propping up manufacturing. And what we're actually seeing is that U.S. manufacturing lost another 12,000 jobs in August. This is not an anomaly. It's the fourth straight month of job loss. It's kind of ironic here because obviously historically high tariffs are supposed to make American manufacturing jobs great again. And I think at best, we're seeing that's off to a very slow start. But at worst, economists are telling me that all of this chaos on the trade front, the tariffs are up and down, they're paused, they're restarted. It's just paralyzing manufacturers, and some of them are shedding jobs. They're cutting workers instead of adding them.
Well, that's why we don't know if this is a real weakening or an inflection point. Corporate America has been really consistent until they get certainty of policy out of Washington, the one big beautiful bill, tariffs, what are those actual rates going to be? They're basically sitting on the sidelines. They're not hiring, they're not firing. A lot of economists will say corporate America is in a place of stasis. Now that there's clarity, what the hope from this administration is that they will actually go out and hire people because they have clarity in terms of what the rates are likely going to be. Most countries are not going to get 15%. So that might be a signal for corporate America to actually go out and hiring, but we don't know yet. That's why the second half of this year, especially going to the midterms next year, is going to be so important.
Yeah, no question. You were talking about, one of you, maybe both of you were talking about the president's approval rating on the economy. Let's just take a look at it. The difference between January, when he became president officially, when he was inaugurated, he was up 6 on this issue of the economy. Now, this is only 8 months later, down 18. That's a pretty big fall.
It's a huge fall, and it is, I think, what is driving some of the Republican concern shaping next year's midterms. But I also think, usually we get to this point in politics and we ask the question of who will be blamed, who will voters blame? I think Trump's actually taking care of that question for us because he made such a show about tariffs. He made such a kind of stamp to make this his own economy that I think at this point, when you still hear White House officials trying to blame Biden or years past, it sounds kind of ridiculous. They have actually ensured that voters tie whatever comes next to their own policy. And I think that's fair because, as we said, the self-imposed nature of it all.
I don't want to lose sight of the interest rates and the Fed of it all.
Too late.
And this is what our colleague Allison Morrow wrote this morning. The Trump administration attempts to wrest control of the Fed by firing Cook without due process and installing Mirren, a rare economist who's criticized Fed independence, could satisfy the president's short-term needs. However, it's all but guaranteed to end badly for the economy if the Fed can't be trusted to protect Americans from runaway inflation or mass unemployment. Fun fact from our producer, Courtney Flancer, you guys probably know this in your, think about this in your sleep. In 1970, Richard Nixon appointed a friend and advisor, Arthur Burns, to be Fed chair. And he also was working on Nixon's reelection campaign, and the economy didn't recover for years.
Yeah, that's when we had the great stagflation.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important lesson here. I mean, we talk about Fed independence. I know it sounds kind of wonky in the weeds, but it matters because if the Fed loses control of inflation, then the cost of living problem that helped get President Trump elected in the first place is only going to get worse. And investors, if they lose confidence that the Fed really means business when it comes to inflation, then you're going to see long-term interest rates go higher and higher. That's going to make it more expensive for the government to borrow, and it's going to lift mortgage rates, right? Making it even harder to buy a home.